All right, ladies and gentlemen, week 15 of the 2024 fantasy football season is kicking off in just a couple hours. And before you set those final rosters, here are 6 things that you need to know heading into week 15 in the first round of the 2024 fantasy football playoffs. All right, first thing that you need to know is that Kenneth Walker is going into Sunday night's game against the Green Bay Packers as doubtful, which is putting Zach Charbonnet in line as another strong fantasy football start here in week 15. Last week, obviously, Walker missed week 14 and Charbonnet came through huge. He was a player, the very first player we talked about in last week's video on Sunday morning, and he had 38.3 fantasy points, 22 touches on the ground, 134 rushing yards, 2 rushing touchdowns, 7 targets, 7 catches, 59 receiving yards. A monster game. This week, he'll get the Green Bay Packers at home on Sunday Night Football, who are right there in the middle, allowing the 16th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. So it's not an awful spot. It's not a great spot, but it's kind of close to where the Cardinals ranked going into last week's game. So I think that Charbonnet is another very strong start. I think that Walker is going to miss this game, but technically at the time I'm recording this, it's not official yet. So we'll see, but Charbonnet is trending going into this week as the starter for the Seahawks. So if you own Charbonnet, I think you got to try and get him into your starting lineup. Now, of course, it depends on who else you have. Before last week, Charbonnet was probably nothing more than a handcuff for you. So it depends on what other running backs you've got, but I think he's going to be another very strong start in this matchup against the Packers, where the Packers trying to do everything that they can to win as many football games to wrap up the season to help secure that playoff spot. Then the Seahawks trying to do whatever they can to win as many football games to stay atop of their division and make it into the playoffs as well. So this is going to be a good competitive game script. Good enough matchup here. If you own Charbonnet, it looks like Walker's going to miss week 15 as well. So go ahead and fire up Zach Charbonnet. He should be a very solid start here in the first round of the playoffs. And speaking of solid starts here in week 15, Brian Robinson Jr. remains one of my overall favorite starts. Going into week 15, he has a smash matchup against the New Orleans Saints on the road, who are allowing the 28th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Obviously, the Commanders on bye week in week 14. But in week 13, Brian Robinson had 16 touches for 103 rushing yards, a rushing touchdown, 1 catch for 6 receiving yards, which resulted in 17.9 fantasy points. The Saints offense extremely banged up. I think this is going to be one of those games where the Commanders get up early on the Saints. The defense plays a large role, and the running game plays a large role as well. It's going to be a big day for Brian Robinson Jr., even if we see some touches go to Chris Rodriguez or potentially Jeremy McNichols as well, on both those running backs' names. But nonetheless, Brian Robinson Jr. is going to be the lead running back here in week 15 on the road against the Saints without a doubt. If you own Brian Robinson Jr., just don't forget he's been very good on the season, averaging 13.5 fantasy points per game. He has double digits in every game on the season except for 2. He's just been banged up. And don't forget that this Commanders offense wants to run the football first and foremost. We've seen that throughout the season. They're going to utilize multiple running backs. They've also done that throughout the course of the season. Austin Eckler is just hurt right now, so that's why we're seeing guys like Rodriguez and McNichols still get involvement. But Brian Robinson Jr. going to be the heartbeat of this Commanders offense in week 15, going to have a huge week. He is an absolute must-start running back going into week 15. You already know one of my favorite lines on Underdog this week is going to be Brian Robinson Jr. to score a touchdown. I also don't mind taking the over on his rushing yards, but either way, I'm headed straight to Underdog to take the over on Brian Robinson Jr. to score a touchdown here in week 15 against this awful Saints run defense. And if you don't already know, all new users who sign up on Underdog using promo code TheCatch, that link is down below, are going to get a free NFL Pick 'em to use towards Week 15. Take your free Pick 'em, Take B-Rob to score a touchdown. Once both of those lines hit, you'll automatically triple your cash entry. And on top of that, Underdog is also giving all new users who sign up with promo code TheCatch a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. So it's a free NFL pick'em for the week, and I'll put my favorite Underdog pick'ems on the screen right now for you guys for week 15, and up to $1,000 in bonus cash on Underdog when you guys sign up using promo code TheCatch. That link is down below. All right, next thing that you need to know is that we have the Breece Hall dilemma here in week 15. What to do with Breece Hall? Now, according to reports, expected to suit up, still technically going into the week as questionable. Obviously, this past week, we saw what a Breece Hall-less backfield would look like for the Jets. A little bit of Braylon Allen and a little bit of Isaiah Davis. And I talked about this in Friday's video. Even if Hall does play, I still think there's a chance that we see some Braylon Allen and maybe even some Isaiah Davis, because I just don't know if Breece Hall's ready to go, if he's 100%. This is such a head-scratching scenario for fantasy managers because, of course, the Jets are playing the Jacksonville Jaguars, who are giving up the 31st most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Like, if the Jets were playing a good run defense like the Chargers or the Chiefs or the Ravens, then I'd probably just stay away from the situation. But it's very difficult to stay away from the situation when the Jets are playing the second worst run defense in the NFL when it comes to fantasy points allowed. So what do we do? Well, it really depends on who else you have, who else are you rostering in terms of flex options, in terms of running back options. If you have better, more consistent options who've been good on the season, honestly, regardless of their matchup, then I probably would just start them over Breece Hall. But there's going to be plenty of rosters. Saw it in last night's Q&A stream that Breece Hall might just have to be an option for you guys. But we also have to wait for Breece Hall to actually be cleared. Luckily, this is in the early slate of games, so we should have some sort of idea, maybe even by the time this video comes out. But nonetheless, this is a situation that I'm trying to avoid for the most part, even with the matchup here, because I do personally believe that we'll see some sort of volume go to Braylon Allen and or Isaiah Davis, and I could be completely wrong on that. That's just my guess. But here in the first round of the fantasy playoffs, these are not the type of situations that I want to be in or type of situations that I want you guys to be in. So just look at what you have, what other options you have. If Breece Hall plays, yes, he's still startable due to the matchup. And taking it a step forward, I think Braylon Allen is still startable as well, but I don't want to count out Isaiah Davis because we basically had an even split between those guys last week. If we include their catches, Braylon Allen had 15 total touches and Isaiah Davis had 13 total touches. Davis scored the touchdown. 15.7 fantasy points for Davis, 12.1 for Braylon Allen. So this is not a good scenario, kind of a nightmare scenario for fantasy managers. Let me know in the comments down below if you are a Breece Hall owner. What are you doing going into week 15? Because as I said in the Q&A stream, I'm going to lay it all out there for you guys, break it down, but I'm leaving it up to you guys. Are you going to start Breece Hall in week 15 or not? And speaking of scenarios that I don't like from a fantasy perspective, we also got to talk about Bucky Irving, who's going into this week listed as questionable. Now, he did practice in a limited capacity on Friday, and that was not his first practice on the week, but this is just one of those things, man. I mean, first he had the hip injury that affected him in week 14, didn't affect him in week 13, was able to play through and had a big game against a really bad Panthers run defense. But I think it was part of what affected him in week 14. But even worse, he suffered a new injury, a back injury in week 14, and has been questionable all week long after missing most of week 14's action with just 4 touches on the ground and 1 target and 1 catch. 2.8 fantasy points in what was probably a matchup that you ended up starting Bucky Irving in because you thought he was going to play, right? And of course, the new injury we can't control, but I think the hip injury was also bothering him, and he wasn't 100% going into that game. But all reports are indicating that he's going to try and play in week 15, but this is a tough matchup As you guys see on the screen, the Chargers are allowing the fourth fewest fantasy points to opposing running backs. And obviously, we have other running backs on this team that are capable. And even if Bucky plays, is he truly going to be the starting running back here? Because Rachaad White had 24.9 fantasy points this past week, 90 yards on the ground, 5.29 yards per carry, 2 catches for 19 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown. Huge game against the Raiders. And even though Sean Tucker didn't get a lot of involvement, just 3 touches, he turned those 3 touches into 47 yards, 15.6 yards per carry, excuse me. So Sean Tucker is a viable RB2. We know this, right? So this is just not a good situation. But I do think there's going to be a push for Bucky Irving to play because this is an important game for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Right now, they are atop of their division, but just by 1 game against the Falcons, and the Saints only have 8 losses as well. And then technically, the Panthers, who have a 1% chance to make the playoffs, have not been eliminated from playoff contention as well. So they're trying to stay atop of that division, point being, and the Chargers, who are right now in a wild card spot and have a very high chance to make the playoffs, even if they lose this week, they're still going to try to be doing every possible thing they can to win this matchup against the Bucs. So we're going to get a good game script here, but it's a tough matchup against the Chargers. We got Rachaad White looming around. We know he can take a lot of touches. Sean Tucker can help too. 2 different injuries over the past 2 games for Bucky Irving. This is similar to the Breece Hall situation. Right now, my gut feeling is saying try to avoid it if possible. I think if Irving plays, we can still get a solid floor here, but you got to be a little bit concerned. Once again, going to lay it all out there for you guys, but it's going to come down to you guys. It's the most important week of the fantasy season yet. If you own Bucky Irving, are you willing to risk it here in week 15? All right, let's move along to a wide receiver and one player who's been on the injury report throughout the week who's cleared and good to go is Jaylen Waddle, now off of the injury report, had been dealing with a hamstring injury, and I really like Jaylen Waddle going into the week against the Houston Texans, who have allowed the 29th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. I talked about Jaylen Waddle in the must-start video, but I did mention he's dealing with a hamstring injury, and we're going to have to pay attention to this as the week progresses, and now we're good to go. He's cleared off the injury report. Jaylen Waddle, double-digit fantasy points in 3 straight games, 20 or more fantasy points in 2 of his last 3 games, 9 or more catches in 2 of his last 3 games as well. In Week 14, tough matchup against the Jets, 12 targets, 9 catches, 99 receiving yards, 20.9 fantasy points. Then once again, we have another scenario here where we're looking at a positive game script. The Dolphins going to do whatever they possibly can to win this game. If they win this game, they have a 29% chance to make the playoffs. If they lose this game, they drop down to a 5% chance to make the playoffs. They are in must-win territory. Coming into this game with 7 losses, while the Broncos and Chargers, as well as the Ravens, all have 5 losses. They're not going to beat the Bills. The Bills have already clinched the AFC East, but they can still fight for a playoff spot in the wild card race. And you got the Texans with 5 losses. Technically, if the Texans lose this game and the Colts beat the Broncos, the Colts are still in the race to win the AFC South. So this is a big game for the Texans and for the Dolphins. Dolphins have been firing on all cylinders. Tua Tagovailoa has been one of the best quarterbacks in the whole NFL, not just fantasy football, but fantasy and the NFL over the last month, over the last 4 games. 2 or more passing touchdowns in every game, 288 passing yards or more with a ceiling of 365 passing yards. And he has had 23 or more fantasy points in every single one of those games. He has been on absolute fire. On top of that, Tyreek Hill's been playing fantastic. Devon Achane's been playing fantastic. Johnny Smith has been playing fantastic. This offense has looked great. Great matchup for Jaylen Waddle. I'm expecting points in this game. This is going to be a good one. And overall, if you own Jaylen Waddle, he's a fantastic flex. This is what you traded for Waddle for. This is what you've been holding out hope for all season long. This is the stretch where we can finally start all of these Dolphins players, and it's a great matchup this week. Great game script. So if you own Jaylen Waddle, I think he's an absolute must-start player going in to Week 15. And last thing that you need to know is that Drew Lock is going to be out this week, more than likely listed as doubtful with both a heel and elbow injury, which is going to leave Tommy DeVito as a starting quarterback for the Giants. And yeah, I do like the Ravens defense as a streaming option. I talked about that the very beginning of the week in our must-start defense video. But what I want to look at here is Malik Nabers, because out of all the Giants fantasy football players, right, we got Nabers and Tyrone Tracy. And that's really it. I mean, maybe in deeper formats, you're looking at Rondell Robinson or Darius Slayton, but, Theo Johnson's hurt. And for majority of you guys, it's going to be Tyrone Tracy and Malik Nabers. And I am worried about Tracy. It's a tough matchup. And now we got DeVito at quarterback. So I think his ceiling lowers. He's had 2 soft run defenses 2 weeks in a row in Dallas and New Orleans. So I'm a bit worried about Tracy, trying to stray away from him if possible. But when it comes to Nabers, I just want to say it's still a very good matchup. This is going to be a matchup where the Giants are forced to throw the football because it's a tough run defense in the Ravens, but they are weaker in terms of their secondary. As you guys see on the screen, the Ravens have allowed the most fantasy points to wide receivers on the season. And I would imagine that the Giants are going to be forced to throw the football in this matchup, as the Ravens, I would assume, will be scoring more points than the Giants in this game. I think that's safe to say. On top of that, the last time DeVito was a starting quarterback for the Giants in Week 12, Nabers did have 12.4 fantasy points, 9 targets, 6 catches, 64 receiving yards. So I think, what we've gotten out of Nabers over the past couple of weeks will still happen here in Week 15. He's been a floor play and nothing more. But I think that the floor is still safe here in Week 15. Look at his last 3 starts, 12.4 points, 15.3, 14.9, somewhere around that area. I still think due to the matchup and the game script, we'll get that type of stat line out of Malik Nabers here in Week 15. So if you own Malik Nabers, don't completely panic. Depends on who else you have, but I still think he is startable this week, a good flex option. Obviously, doesn't have the highest ceiling, doesn't really have any touchdown upside. We haven't seen a touchdown out of Nabers since Week 3 of the season, just 3 touchdowns on the year. But nonetheless, the matchup is still here, still there in Week 16 against the Falcons. It's still pretty good in Week 17 against the Colts. And ultimately, he should be in your starting lineup unless you have better options. Tommy DeVito will still get it done for Malik Nabers. Don't completely panic here in Week 15 if you have to roll with Malik Nabers. And that'll do it for today's video. There are 6 things you need to know heading into Week 15 of the 2024 fantasy football season. As always, guys, I'm answering as many fantasy football questions in the comment section down below as I possibly can. So whatever you guys need, drop me a comment. I'll answer as many comments as I can. But most importantly, make sure that you guys are subscribed to the channel, because we're going to have every single thing you guys could need for the rest of the fantasy season to help you guys dominate your fantasy football leagues and bring home that championship trophy. So make sure that you guys are subscribed so that you don't miss out on any of the content. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on the catch.